Don't believe the headlines. You think the Philippines is still America's loyal ally in Southeast Asia, the one country Washington can count on to counter Chinese expansion in the South China Sea. That narrative died 6 months ago, quietly in a conference room in Beijing, where Philippine and Chinese officials signed 23 infrastructure agreements worth a combined $780 billion over 15 years. While American admirals were sailing freedom of navigation operations through contested waters and State Department officials were drafting press releases about shared democratic values, Manila made a calculation that should terrify everyone in Washington. Chinese money is worth more than American military protection. This isn't about ideology. This isn't about democracy versus authoritarianism. This is about cold, hard mathematics. The Philippines looked at what the United States offers, looked at what China offers, and concluded that infrastructure beats aircraft carriers, that high-speed rail beats military bases, and that economic development beats security guarantees that Washington may not honor when tested. $780 billion. That number represents the largest foreign infrastructure investment in Philippine history. It represents more capital than the United States has provided to the Philippines in the entire 75 years since independence. And it represents the precise moment America's alliance system in Asia started collapsing, not through military defeat, but through economic obsolescence. I'm going to show you with real numbers and hard data how this happened, why American officials completely missed it until too late, and why the Philippines won't be the last American ally to make this calculation. Because here's what the think tanks in Washington refuse to acknowledge. The United States is losing the competition for alliance loyalty in the developing world, not because of military weakness, but because it stopped offering the one thing that actually matters to most countries: economic development. And China just demonstrated in Manila exactly how much that oversight costs. The U.S.-Philippine alliance is supposed to be unshakable. Mutual Defense Treaty signed in 1951. Colonial history going back to 1898. Cultural ties through language, education, and massive Filipino diaspora in America. Shared combat in World War II, Korea, Vietnam. The Visiting Forces Agreement allowing U.S. military access. Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement permitting American troops at Philippine bases. On paper, this alliance looks more durable than U.S. partnerships with countries that joined NATO decades later. But here's what changed. The economics of the relationship became catastrophically one-sided, and Philippine policymakers started noticing. Let me give you the numbers that tell the real story. U.S. foreign direct investment in the Philippines totaled $9.2 billion in 2023. Sounds substantial until you realize that represents only 3.7% of total FDI in the Philippines. Japan invested $17.4 billion, Singapore invested $12.8 billion, and China invested $14.6 billion in the same year. America's economic footprint in its oldest Asian ally ranks fourth. U.S. development assistance to the Philippines averaged $320 million annually between 2020 and 2024. China provided infrastructure financing worth an average of $42 billion annually during the same period. The ratio is 131 to 1. For every dollar America spent on Philippine development, China spent 131. Here's where it gets worse for Washington. That American development assistance comes with conditions: governance reforms, anti-corruption measures, human rights improvements, environmental standards. China's infrastructure financing comes with one condition: sign the contract. A Philippine infrastructure minister described the difference to Reuters as America offers you a lecture and a small check. China offers you a railway and a port. The Duterte administration, from 2016 to 2022, tried to pivot toward China while maintaining security ties with the United States. American officials treated this as an aberration, a temporary deviation caused by Duterte's personal eccentricities that would end when he left office. They were catastrophically wrong. When Ferdinand Marcos Jr. took office in June 2022, Washington breathed a sigh of relief. Marcos made all the right noises about strengthening the alliance. He allowed expanded U.S. military access to 4 additional bases under EDCA. He condemned Chinese behavior in the South China Sea. American analysts declared the alliance restored. But while Marcos was saying what Washington wanted to hear, his economic team was in Beijing negotiating the largest infrastructure package in Philippine history, $780 billion. Let that sink in. That's larger than the entire Philippine GDP, which stood at $440 billion in 2023. China just offered to invest 1.7 times the annual economic output of the Philippines in infrastructure over 15 years. The package includes 6 high-speed railway lines connecting Manila to provincial cities, 4 deep-water ports, 3 international airports, 17 industrial parks, nationwide 5G telecommunications infrastructure, and 3 nuclear power plants. The total length of proposed high-speed rail exceeds 3,000 kilometers. The United States has built exactly 0 kilometers of high-speed rail in the Philippines in 75 years of alliance. Think about what this means from Manila's perspective. The United States offers security guarantees of uncertain reliability against a threat that hasn't manifested in kinetic form. China offers certainty, physical infrastructure that will exist regardless of future political changes, that will generate economic activity, employment, and development that no military base provides. Here's the part of the story American officials don't want to confront. U.S. security guarantees to the Philippines carry a massive credibility problem that Manila's leadership understands perfectly, even if they're too diplomatic to say it publicly. The Mutual Defense Treaty obligates the United States to respond to armed attacks on Philippine forces, public vessels, or aircraft in the Pacific, including the South China Sea. That sounds ironclad. But Philippine policymakers remember Scarborough Shoal in 2012. China seized Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines in a 2-month standoff. Philippine vessels were present, Chinese vessels were present, and the situation met every criterion for invoking the Mutual Defense Treaty. The Philippines asked the United States for support. The Obama administration responded with diplomatic statements and expressions of concern. No military action, no consequences for China. China still controls Scarborough Shoal 12 years later. A former Philippine defense secretary told the Congressional Research Service investigators that the Scarborough incident taught Manila a brutal lesson. American security guarantees are worth exactly what Washington decides they're worth in the moment of crisis. And that calculation includes factors beyond Philippine interests. We learned that treaty obligations are interpreted through the lens of American domestic politics and global priorities. The South China Sea doesn't rank high enough to risk conflict with China. Flash forward to 2023. Chinese Coast Guard vessels used water cannons against Philippine supply ships headed to Second Thomas Shoal, injuring Filipino sailors. This was unambiguously an attack on Philippine forces in Philippine-claimed waters. Did the United States invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty? No. The State Department issued a statement condemning the Chinese action. The 7th Fleet conducted a freedom of navigation operation nearby, but no consequences for China. Manila is watching this pattern and drawing conclusions. If water cannons against Philippine sailors don't trigger treaty obligations, what will? Chinese policymakers are drawing the same conclusions. Beijing understands that America won't fight China over disputed rocks in the South China Sea, which means Chinese coercion of the Philippines carries minimal risk. Now contrast this with what China offers. The $780 billion infrastructure package doesn't depend on ambiguous interpretations or crisis moment calculations. It's a contract. The high-speed rail either gets built or it doesn't. The ports either open or they don't. There's no scenario where China says, we're very concerned about the lack of infrastructure, but we need to consider our broader strategic priorities before acting. This is why economic development beats security guarantees in the current environment. Security guarantees are promises about uncertain future behavior during hypothetical crises. Infrastructure deals are concrete transactions with specified deliverables and timelines. From Manila's perspective, which would you rather have? America's promise to maybe defend you against Chinese coercion that hasn't escalated to armed conflict, or China's commitment to build transportation infrastructure that will definitely exist and definitely improve your economy? The Philippines chose certainty over ambiguity. And the terrifying thing for Washington is that every other American ally in Southeast Asia is watching this calculation and running the same numbers. To understand why the Philippines made this choice, you need to understand the catastrophic infrastructure deficit that defines Filipino economic reality. The numbers are staggering. The Asian Development Bank estimates the Philippines needs to invest $211 billion in infrastructure by 2030 just to maintain current economic growth rates. That's $14 billion per year. The Philippine government's infrastructure budget in 2024 was $9.3 billion. The shortfall is $4.7 billion annually, compounding into backlog that grows worse every year. Here's what that shortfall looks like on the ground. Manila has the worst traffic congestion in Southeast Asia. The average commute time in Metro Manila is 73 minutes each way. Traffic congestion costs the Philippine economy an estimated $13.3 billion annually in lost productivity, equivalent to 3% of GDP. That's an annual recurring cost larger than total U.S. development assistance. The Philippines has 3,000 kilometers of coastline and 7,600 islands. Inter-island shipping is the primary means of transport for most goods and people. But the country has exactly 4 deep-water ports capable of handling modern container ships. Shipping costs in the Philippines are 47% higher than the Southeast Asian average because of port infrastructure bottlenecks. This adds approximately $8 billion annually to the cost of goods, driving inflation and reducing competitiveness. Electricity costs in the Philippines are the second highest in Asia. Manufacturing firms pay an average of 12.3 cents per kilowatt hour compared to 6.8 cents in Vietnam and 5.1 cents in Indonesia. This cost differential drives industrial investment to neighboring countries, costing the Philippines an estimated 32,000 manufacturing jobs annually, according to Philippine Chamber of Commerce data. The infrastructure gap isn't just inconvenient. It's an existential economic problem. The Philippines is losing competitiveness to Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand because it can't move goods efficiently, power factories affordably, or connect production zones to ports. Every year this gap persists, the Philippines falls further behind its neighbors in attracting the manufacturing investment that drives middle-income to high-income transitions. And here's the critical part. The United States isn't offering to fix this. American development assistance focuses on governance, education, health systems, and security sector reform. These are valuable, but they don't build railways or ports or power plants. The U.S. Development Finance Corporation provides loan guarantees and investment insurance, not the upfront capital required for massive infrastructure projects that won't generate returns for 15 years. China looked at this gap and made an offer that addresses it directly. 6 high-speed railway lines that will cut travel times by 70 to 80%, reducing the traffic congestion costs from $13.3 billion annually to an estimated $4.1 billion, a $9.2 billion annual benefit. 4 deep-water ports that will reduce shipping costs from 47% above regional average to competitive parity, saving $8 billion annually. 3 nuclear power plants generating electricity at costs competitive with regional competitors, saving manufacturers approximately $6 billion annually. Add those annual benefits together, $23.2 billion per year once infrastructure is operational. Multiply by 15 years, $348 billion in cumulative economic benefit. China's offer isn't charity. It's a commercial proposition that generates returns exceeding costs even at the $780 billion price tag. The Philippine Economic Planning Agency ran exactly this calculation and concluded that the Chinese package would accelerate GDP growth by 2.4 percentage points annually, lifting an additional 11 million Filipinos out of poverty by 2040. No amount of American security guarantees or governance assistance achieves that outcome. Now let's address the elephant in the room, the South China Sea territorial disputes. American analysts assume these disputes make a comprehensive Philippines-China partnership impossible. They're wrong, and here's why. The Philippines claims exclusive economic zones around various features in the Spratly Islands based on the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. China claims sovereignty over most of the South China Sea based on historical rights mapped by the 9-dash line. The 2016 Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling sided with the Philippines, rejecting China's historical claims. China ignored the ruling. Impasse. American analysis stops there, concluding the disputes are irreconcilable and permanent friction is inevitable. But Manila and Beijing have been quietly negotiating a deal that transforms the dispute from zero-sum confrontation into a framework for resource sharing and joint development. The proposal, leaked to the Philippine press in March 2024 and subsequently confirmed by officials on both sides, works like this. The Philippines maintains its legal claims and doesn't formally recognize Chinese sovereignty. China maintains its claims and doesn't withdraw from occupied features. Both sides agree to shelve the dispute for 50 years while pursuing joint development of resources in disputed zones. Specifically, oil and gas reserves estimated at 11 billion barrels of oil equivalent would be developed through joint ventures, where Philippine firms hold 51% equity and Chinese firms hold 49%. The revenue split would be 60% Philippines, 40% China. Undersea natural gas would be piped to the Philippines for domestic consumption, reducing Philippine energy imports by approximately 63%. Think about what this does to the strategic calculus. The South China Sea dispute currently generates zero economic value for the Philippines, while imposing costs through maritime incidents, diplomatic friction, and military spending. The Joint Development Framework generates estimated revenue of $18 billion annually for the Philippines based on current energy prices, while allowing both sides to maintain their legal positions. From Manila's perspective, this is pure upside. The Philippines gets majority equity and revenue from resources it currently can't access because of the dispute. China gets minority stakes and some revenue from resources it currently controls militarily but can't develop unilaterally without triggering international condemnation and potential sanctions. Both sides profit, and the dispute becomes an economic asset rather than a strategic liability. The United States opposes this framework because it rewards Chinese coercion and undermines the principle that territorial disputes should be resolved through international law rather than bilateral negotiation. But Philippine officials don't care about principles that generate zero revenue. They care about $18 billion annually in energy income that can finance development projects, reduce electricity costs, and accelerate economic growth. Here's the brutal reality. The United States wants the Philippines to sacrifice economic development to uphold legal principles and counter Chinese expansion. China wants the Philippines to compromise on legal principles in exchange for economic development. One of these offers aligns with Philippine national interests. The other aligns with American global strategy. Manila chose its own interests, and this is happening across the global South. Countries are tired of being asked to absorb costs for maintaining international orders that primarily benefit the developed economies that design those orders. When China offers to share the benefits of rule-breaking, the principled objections start looking less compelling. There's another dimension to the Philippine calculation that American analysts consistently underestimate: technological sovereignty and the desire to escape dependence on Western digital infrastructure. The $780 billion Chinese package includes nationwide 5G telecommunications infrastructure built by Huawei and ZTE. The United States has been pressuring allies globally to exclude Chinese telecommunications equipment on security grounds, arguing that Huawei infrastructure creates espionage vulnerabilities and dependence on Chinese technology. The Philippines looked at this argument and rejected it, not because Filipino officials are unconcerned about security, but because the alternative is worse. Here's the calculation they made. Excluding Chinese vendors means choosing between European suppliers like Ericsson and Nokia or American suppliers like Cisco. The cost differential is substantial. Huawei's 5G infrastructure bid for the Philippines totaled $8.4 billion. Ericsson's bid totaled $14.7 billion. The Chinese offer was 43% cheaper for equivalent technical specifications. But the cost differential is only part of the equation. The more important factor is technological transfer and domestic capacity building. Huawei's package includes joint venture partnerships with Philippine telecommunications companies, where Filipino engineers receive training and technology transfer that builds domestic expertise. The Western vendors offer turnkey solutions with minimal technology transfer because they want to maintain proprietary control over critical components. Philippine officials explicitly stated they want to develop indigenous technological capacity rather than permanent dependence on foreign vendors. The Chinese model, whatever its security implications, actually transfers knowledge and capability. The Western model maintains dependence indefinitely. There's also a political economy dimension. The Philippine telecommunications sector is dominated by two companies, PLDT and Globe Telecom, which have historically maintained duopoly pricing that keeps costs high for consumers. Chinese infrastructure investment creates competitive pressure that benefits consumers while breaking the political influence of entrenched telecom oligarchs. The United States sees this as the Philippines choosing espionage risk over security. The Philippines sees this as choosing development and technological sovereignty over permanent dependence on Western vendors that charge premium prices and transfer zero knowledge. Who's right depends on what you value. If you prioritize security above all else, the American argument makes sense. If you prioritize development and sovereignty, the Philippine calculation makes sense. And here's the thing, most developing countries are running the same calculation and reaching the same conclusion. The United States is losing the technology competition in the developing world not because Chinese technology is superior, but because China offers what developing countries actually want: lower costs, technology transfer, and reduced dependence on the West. Until Washington understands that security arguments don't resonate with countries that prioritize development over geopolitical alignment, it will keep losing these competitions. Now zoom out and understand what the Philippine decision means for U.S. alliance architecture in Asia. Because Manila isn't making this choice in isolation. Every American ally in Southeast Asia is watching and updating its strategic calculations. Thailand has already signed memorandums of understanding with China for a $38 billion high-speed rail network connecting Bangkok to the Chinese border. Malaysia diverted its East Coast Rail Link project to Chinese financing after initial plans for Japanese funding fell through. Indonesia awarded its Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail project to China, despite strong Japanese competition. Vietnam maintains territorial disputes with China in the South China Sea, but signed infrastructure deals worth $68 billion. The pattern is consistent. U.S. allies in Southeast Asia maintain security relationships with Washington while accepting infrastructure financing from Beijing. This bifurcation is exactly what American strategists feared because it creates dependencies that limit allied freedom of action during crises. But here's what American analysis gets wrong. It assumes these dependencies are traps that countries stumbled into. They're not. They're calculated choices based on accurate assessment of what each great power offers and what each ally needs. The United States offers military protection against a Chinese threat that has not manifested in kinetic form for any Southeast Asian country in decades. China offers infrastructure financing that addresses immediate economic needs with measurable impacts on growth, employment, and development. From the perspective of elected officials facing voters who care about jobs and living standards, which offer is more valuable? The security development trade-off that defines the alliance competition reveals a fundamental asymmetry. The United States assumes allies should prioritize security because that's what superpowers care about. Allies prioritize development because that's what voters care about. And in democratic systems, politicians who ignore voter priorities lose elections. This is why China is winning the alliance competition, despite having a smaller military, fewer bases, and less sophisticated weaponry. China is offering what politicians need to stay in power: economic growth that voters can see and feel. The United States is offering what strategists think politicians should value: protection against hypothetical future threats. The Philippine decision makes this asymmetry explicit and unavoidable. Manila is telling Washington directly, we value Chinese infrastructure more than American security guarantees. And unless the United States develops a competitive offer on the economic development dimension, it will keep losing these competitions. This is the part that should enrage American taxpayers because the infrastructure competition with China was winnable. The United States chose not to compete. The total U.S. development assistance budget globally in 2024 was $37 billion. That's less than 6% of the defense budget. China's Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure spending in the same year exceeded $200 billion. The spending gap reflects priorities. America spends on military capabilities to maintain security dominance. China spends on infrastructure to build economic dependencies. But here's the thing: America could afford to match Chinese infrastructure spending without meaningful budget strain. $780 billion over 15 years is $52 billion annually. The United States spends $840 billion annually on defense. Matching the Philippine package would require increasing the overall federal budget by 0.6%.